It is January 1945, and the Ardennes forest is a frozen tomb for thousands of Allied soldiers. Within the Allied High Command, a different kind of war is raging. One fought not with tanks, but with classified cables and suppressed reports. General George S. Patton, the victor of Bastogne, sits in the crosshairs of his own superiors, facing a disciplinary tribunal that could end his career. Was Patton's survival a stroke of luck, or the result of a secret diplomatic lifeline cast by Winston Churchill? The winter of 1944 had transformed the European theater of operations into a powder keg of personality clashes and strategic divergence. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, found himself squeezed between the demands of his British allies and the volatile, often insubordinate brilliance of his own Third Army commander, George S. Patton. To understand why Patton stood on the brink of a court-martial, one must look beyond the mud of the Ardennes and into the high-stakes political back-channels of the Anglo-American alliance. Eisenhower's Broadfront strategy was predicated on meticulous coordination, yet Patton's Third Army operated like a runaway locomotive, frequently ignoring administrative boundaries and logistical constraints to secure rapid, opportunistic gains. The tension was not merely personal, it was systemic. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group, consistently pushed for a singular, concentrated thrust into Germany, a strategy that required diverting precious resources away from Patton's drive. Eisenhower, desperate to maintain the fragile coalition, often sacrificed Patton's speed to appease Montgomery's demands for stability and caution. Major General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, became the architect of this administrative friction, frequently tightening the logistical spigot of fuel and ammunition to ensure Patton remained on a short leash. Patton, aware that his movements were being hampered by the very men supposed to be supporting him, began to bypass official channels, communicating his frustrations directly to the press and anyone within the U.S. War Department who would listen. By the time the German Ardennes offensive broke in December 1944, the discord reached a breaking point. Eisenhower, forced to transfer command of the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies to Montgomery to stabilize the northern shoulder, faced a near mutiny from his own American subordinates. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th U.S. Army Group, felt the move was a public humiliation for American arms, and Patton, though tasked with the most difficult maneuver of the war, a 90-degree pivot of an entire army in near-zero visibility, felt his autonomy was being eroded by the hour. Patton's staff, led by his loyal chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay, viewed the logistical shortages during the pivot not as theater-wide necessity, but as deliberate sabotage. The diary entries of Hobart Gay capture the mounting paranoia at Third Army headquarters. He noted on December 18, 1944, that Patton viewed the German breakthrough as a magnificent opportunity, yet the operational reality remained hostage to the availability of Class III fuel supplies. Patton's ability to relieve Bastogne was a masterstroke of tactical speed, but it left him exposed to the administrative hawks in Versailles. As Patton continued to push toward the Rhine, Bedell Smith began compiling a dossier on Patton's insubordination, including his unauthorized press contacts and his vocal criticism of the Broadfront strategy. The threat was no longer theoretical. General George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, had grown tired of Patton's recurring scandals, from the Sicily slapping incidents to his controversial Knutsford speech regarding post-war world order. Marshall signaled to Eisenhower that a formal disciplinary tribunal was now a distinct possibility if Patton continued to undermine the coalition's public image. This presented Eisenhower with a strategic dilemma of impossible proportions. If he removed Patton, he would lose his most effective fighting commander and provoke an uproar in the American press, which had branded Patton the savior of the Ardennes. If he kept him, he risked the unity of the Allied command and the political stability of his relationship with Montgomery and the British High Command. While Eisenhower struggled, Winston Churchill was playing a different game. The Prime Minister, romanticizing the aggressive maneuvers of the Third Army, viewed Patton as the only general capable of ending the war before the Soviet Union could secure a dominant position in Central Europe. Churchill knew that Montgomery's methodical approach, while safer, was surrendering the operational initiative to the Wehrmacht. He understood that speed was the only currency that mattered in the final months of the war, and Patton was the only general in the Allied order of battle who traded in that currency exclusively. Churchill's intervention began with informal, back-channel communications that bypassed the combined chiefs of staff. He contacted Roosevelt, framing the potential removal of Patton not as a disciplinary matter, but as a self-inflicted strategic defeat. Churchill argued that the coalition could not afford to lose its most effective tactical commander on the eve of the final drive into Germany. This was not the first time Churchill had acted as Patton's shield. During the Knutsford incident of 1944, when Marshal had ordered Patton's reduction in rank to colonel, it was Churchill who whispered into Eisenhower's ear that Patton had simply told the truth. Eisenhower, however, felt the heat from Bedell Smith and the British High Command, led by Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke. Brooke viewed Patton as a liability, a loose cannon who threatened the delicate balance of the Broadfront strategy. The logistical manipulation, the starving of Patton's fuel reserves, was designed to prove that Patton's rapid advances were unsustainable. Yet Patton's G4 staff had learned to adapt, finding German gasoline caches and prioritizing their own logistics to keep the armor rolling, effectively defying the very Broadfront mandate they were meant to support. The psychological toll on Eisenhower was immense. He was being pulled in two directions by forces he struggled to contain. His chief of staff, Bedell Smith, suffered from chronic ulcers, fueled by the stress of trying to manage Patton's independent entity of an army. In January 1945, Bedell Smith sent a confidential memorandum to Eisenhower demanding that the SHAEF take action against Patton's public criticisms of their strategy. Smith believed that without a formal tribunal, the Third Army would continue to operate as a separate war, outside the authority of the Supreme Allied Commander. Patton, meanwhile, remained defiant. In a letter to his wife, Beatrice, on March 23, 1945, he boasted of crossing the Rhine without the help from the grand planners in Versailles. He was fully aware of the tribunal discussions and viewed the logisticians at SHAEF as mere obstacles to his success. He believed that victory was his ultimate protection, and as long as his tanks were moving faster than those of any other Allied unit, the political leadership in Washington and London dared not touch him. The friction reached a crescendo during the planning of the final drive into Germany. Montgomery, still reeling from the backlash of his press conference where he claimed credit for saving the Americans at the Bulge, sought to re-establish his reputation as the premier Allied commander. He demanded that Eisenhower provide him with sole command of all ground forces for the final push. Eisenhower, now forced to appease both the British cabinet and the increasingly restless American commanders, was pushed to his limit. Churchill's back channel became the most important communications link in the war. He continued to warn Eisenhower that any attempt to sideline Patton would cause an irreparable breach in the alliance. He insisted that Patton's aggression was the only way to beat the Red Army to Prague and the central German industrial heartland. Eisenhower found himself in a paradox. To save the alliance, he had to keep a general who was actively sabotaging his own strategic directives. The Patton problem was not a military issue anymore. It was the focal point of the Cold War struggle before the war had even ended. As the Third Army prepared to penetrate deeper into Bavaria, Bedell Smith pushed Eisenhower for a final decision on the tribunal. Marshal had demanded a full investigation into Patton's unauthorized press leaks. Eisenhower requested one last private conversation with the Prime Minister. The transcripts of these communications remain some of the most classified documents of the period, but the result was clear. The decision to postpone the tribunal was made, not out of mercy, but out of political survival. Eisenhower warned Patton that any further unauthorized contact with the press would be his last, but he refused to grant the tribunal the mandate it needed. The logistical restrictions remained, however, as the primary method of control. If Patton could not be court-martialed, he could at least be starved of the fuel necessary to reach his objectives ahead of his British counterparts. Patton, sensing the tightening grip, took even more extreme risks to keep his Third Army moving. The stage was set for the final, unauthorized crossing of the Rhine at Oppenheim. Patton knew that if he reached the river before Montgomery's highly prepared Operation Plunder, it would be the ultimate defiance of SHAEF authority. He ordered his 12th Corps to advance toward the Kill River, operating with less than a 2-day fuel reserve, refusing to halt despite the frantic radio warnings from Eisenhower's headquarters. The risk was absolute. If the Germans counterattacked, Patton would have no supplies and no reserves. As the Third Army moved into position, Patton's staff made a final, clandestine effort to bypass the G4 allocations. They rerouted fuel trucks intended for other units, creating a logistical crisis that Bedell Smith would later call administrative anarchy. Patton sat in his mobile command post, staring at the map of the Rhine, aware that the tribunal was still a looming reality, yet more concerned with the speed of his tanks than the judgment of his peers. He was about to break the Broadfront strategy, defy his superiors, and change the geopolitical map of post-war Europe, all while Churchill watched from London, holding the only lifeline that could keep him in command. The crossing at Oppenheim was not merely a tactical maneuver. It was an act of operational rebellion that shattered the illusion of SHAEF's control. When Patton's Third Army successfully bridged the Rhine on the night of March 22, 1945, days before Montgomery's meticulously planned Operation Plunder, the shockwave was felt not only in Berlin, but in the corridors of power in London and Versailles. Patton had bypassed the logistical constraints imposed by Bedell Smith by scavenging German supplies and cannibalizing the transport of non-combat units. He had arrived at the river with a speed that defied the mathematical models of Eisenhower's planners, essentially forcing the Supreme Commander to accept a fait accompli. Yet the price of this victory was immediate. Eisenhower, under immense pressure from the British High Command, was forced to confront the general who had humiliated the Broadfront strategy on a global stage. The fallout was instantaneous. Bedell Smith, fueled by frustration and a sense of betrayal, drafted a formal recommendation for Patton's immediate relief from command, citing willful insubordination and the endangerment of Allied operational unity. The document was ready for Eisenhower's signature by dawn on March 23rd. This was the moment the disciplinary tribunal was intended to begin, a formal hearing that would have stripped Patton of his Third Army and ended his career in disgrace. However, a sudden high-priority cable arrived from the British Prime Minister's office, marked eyes only for General Eisenhower. Winston Churchill, fully aware that the Oppenheim crossing had become a political symbol of American prowess, moved decisively to neutralize the move against Patton. Churchill's message was a masterclass in strategic diplomacy. He did not plead for Patton. He instead framed the Third Army's success as a critical turning point that necessitated a unified, aggressive spirit across all Allied fronts to prevent a prolonged German resistance in the Alpine Redoubt. By linking Patton's tactical aggression to the ultimate goal of preventing a post-war Soviet occupation of Central Europe, Churchill effectively made the prospect of firing Patton a decision that could be painted as a favor to Moscow. Eisenhower, reading the cable, understood the implication. To remove Patton now would be to publicly acknowledge that the Allied command was more interested in internal discipline than in the rapid destruction of the Wehrmacht. The tribunal was effectively dead on arrival. The irony of the situation was that Patton remained blissfully, or perhaps intentionally, ignorant of how close he had come to the end. While Eisenhower and Smith sparred with the political fallout in Versailles, Patton was already deep into the heart of Germany, pushing his units toward the main river with a ferocity that stunned German defenders. Major General Hobart Gay, noting the intensity of the push in his diary, recorded that the general had become even more mercurial, alternating between moments of absolute visionary focus and bouts of intense private rage against the bureaucrats in the rear who he felt were still trying to siphon off his fuel. The Patton problem, however, had simply shifted its focus. With the tribunal threat neutralized, the rivalry between Patton and Montgomery intensified into a bitter, public, and private battle of wills regarding the occupation of German territory. Churchill, having saved Patton, now found himself managing a new crisis. The realization that the American Third Army was rapidly outdistancing the British 21st Army Group, potentially leaving Montgomery behind in the race for Berlin and the occupation of the German industrial centers. The tension was no longer about fuel. It was about the shape of the post-war world. If Patton reached the Elbe first, the American influence in a divided Germany would be absolute. Eisenhower, caught once again in the middle, had to perform an impossible balancing act. He had to keep Patton moving to maintain military pressure, but he had to keep him within the political bounds established by the Yalta Conference and the agreements made with the Soviet High Command. The logistical starvation of the Third Army was replaced by a more overt, directive-based control. Eisenhower issued a direct order for the Third Army to halt or change its vector toward Czechoslovakia, explicitly forbidding Patton from taking Prague. This order was the culmination of the strategic friction that had defined the 1945 campaign. It was a decision driven not by military necessity, but by the burgeoning reality of the Cold War. Patton, upon receiving the order to stop, reportedly erupted in a private, profane tirade that was heard by his entire command staff. He viewed the order as a betrayal not only of his men, but of the entire objective of the war. Hobart Gay recorded this as the blackest moment of the campaign, as the Third Army, which had been the tip of the spear, was now being asked to sit in place while the political endgame was decided in halls far removed from the front. The decision to halt was, in the eyes of many modern historians, the moment the Allies consciously sacrificed military advantage for a diplomatic status quo that would define the next 40 years. But why did Churchill, who had initially saved Patton to ensure the war ended quickly, acquiesce to this halt? The answer lies in the shifting dynamics of the Anglo-American relationship. By April 1945, the British were exhausted, and Churchill was acutely aware that the United States held the only true economic and military leverage over the future of Europe. He realized that pushing Eisenhower further to support Patton would only isolate the British position. He had used Patton as a tool for the military conclusion of the war. He was now forced to trade that tool for political alignment with Washington. As the Third Army sat in place, the frustration within the ranks was palpable. The men who had fought from the Normandy beaches to the heart of the Third Reich now found themselves in an uncomfortable, stagnant position as occupiers rather than liberators. Patton's interactions with the press during this period became increasingly erratic, as he tried to reconcile his personal philosophy of total victory with the cold, bureaucratic reality of the occupation zones. This ultimately provided the very ammunition. The final act of the Patton problem came with the post-war administration of Bavaria. Patton once again made public comments comparing the Nazi Party to the political parties back home, arguing that a functional administrative structure was needed to rebuild Germany, regardless of the individual's previous party membership. This was the last straw. Eisenhower, now stripped of the protective shield of Churchill's strategic necessity, had no further reason to tolerate the insubordination. He relieved Patton of the Third Army and transferred him to the 15th Army, a paper army tasked with recording the history of the war. One must consider, what if the tribunal had proceeded? If Patton had been dismissed in December 1944, would the Battle of the Bulge have been resolved as rapidly? The evidence suggests that the delay in reaction from the northern shoulder would have allowed for a much deeper German penetration, potentially stalling the Allied momentum until the spring of 1945. Patton's survival in command was a strategic imperative that the military planners at SHAEF failed to appreciate because they were looking at the map through the lens of administration rather than the lens of speed. The irony is that the very traits which made Patton a legend, his absolute intolerance for hesitation, his demand for total movement, and his disdain for the planners, were the exact traits that made him a logistical nightmare for a coalition built on compromise. His relationship with Eisenhower was not merely one of commander and subordinate. It was a clash between the future of professional, bureaucratic military management and the fading archetype of the individual, aggressive commander. When we look back at the telegrams and the cables exchanged between London, Washington, and Versailles, it is clear that Patton survived not because he was right in his methods, but because he was essential to the result. Churchill's lifeline was the bridge between an old world that understood the necessity of the great commander and a new world that demanded the synchronization of the great organization. As the war ended, Patton remained a man without a war to fight, eventually meeting his end in a mundane accident in Germany, far from the battlefield he so craved. The tribunal he feared never happened in a courtroom. It happened in the history books, where he continues to be judged by the very standards of coordination he spent his life fighting against. Perhaps the most haunting question of the entire saga is whether Eisenhower ever truly regretted his dependence on Patton. In his later years, he wrote extensively about the management of his commanders, and while he praised Patton's tactical brilliance, he always tempered it with the caveat of the burden he represented to the alliance. Patton never saw the burden. He only saw the objective. In the end, it was that single-mindedness that both defined his genius and ensured his eventual removal from the history he helped create. What do you think was the greater tragedy for the Allied war effort? The administrative friction that slowed the advance to keep the coalition together, or the loss of momentum caused by the Broadfront strategy in the final months of the war? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.